They called her the Queen of New York, but when she died, no bells rang, no public mourning, no carriages lined the street, no tribute from the society she once ruled. Just a discreet obituary buried in the back of a paper she used to control. Caroline Aster had once dictated the rhythm of New York's elite, who rose, who fell, who never even got to try. But when the curtain finally fell on her life, it didn't echo, it evaporated. She didn't wear a crown. She didn't sit on a throne. She didn't have soldiers or servants or an empire forged by war. But what she controlled was far more dangerous, because Caroline Aster ruled over perception, over legacy, over who mattered and who never would. Before the scandal, before the silence, before the Gilded Age turned on her like a beautiful snake that had outgrown its keeper, she was just a girl born into a city, gasping for identity. Her story didn't begin with riches. It began with expectation. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 to one of New York's oldest Dutch families. The Schermerhorns had bloodlines that predated the American Revolution. They didn't boast. They whispered. They didn't flaunt. They positioned. New York was changing. The Civil War had ended, and industry was booming. Fortunes were being made overnight in steel, oil, and railroad empires. But with this explosion of wealth came a new kind of social chaos. Suddenly, people who had never been invited to the ballroom were building their own. So she made a list. It wasn't printed, it wasn't published, but it became legend. The 400. That's how many people her ballroom could fit, and that's how many people mattered. If you weren't on the list, you were no one. You didn't exist. You could own factories, railroads, whole cities. It didn't matter. You weren't 400. You were out. Caroline's list became the blueprint for New York's high society. She curated the families who would shape the city's image. She decided who could marry whom. She knew how much scandal was too much. She built an empire of velvet ropes and closed doors, and for a time no one dared challenge her. Until Alva Vanderbilt. So she declared war. In 1883, Alva hosted a costume ball in her brand-new Fifth Avenue mansion. It was opulent, ridiculous, unforgivably extravagant. French chefs, imported marble, gowns that shimmered like weapons. Every member of New York society was invited. Except Caroline Aster. It was a statement, a declaration that the old rules were dead, and society, eager for something new, took notice. Newspapers buzzed. Socialites whispered. For the first time, someone had outshined Caroline, not in class, but in spectacle. She didn't respond publicly. She didn't have to. But inside her fortress of rules and legacy, the foundations were starting to shake. Her own daughter, Carrie Astor, began asking why she couldn't attend events like Alva's, why they had to maintain a decorum no one else seemed to follow. Caroline answered with silence, then with a strategy. If she couldn't stop the tide, she'd own the shoreline. But appeasement didn't stop the future. The Gilded Age wasn't just about wealth. It was about speed, about transformation. Immigrants flooded the city. Technology changed how people lived, dressed, moved. Social climbing became less about pedigree and more about spectacle. And Caroline, despite her efforts, was becoming a relic. She built a new ballroom, bigger, louder, designed not just for elegance but dominance. The Astor mansion on Fifth Avenue became a palace of control. Her events were still legendary, but they had become reminders of what was, rather than what would be. The real test came not from society, but from her daughter. Carrie wanted to marry into the Roosevelt family. Caroline disapproved. It wasn't the match, it was the message. She didn't want to share power, not even with her blood. But Carrie insisted. She defied her mother, married against her will, and stepped out of the shadow of the woman who had shaped New York's elite. It was the first public crack in the Astor legacy, and Caroline felt it like a fracture through her spine. She hosted galas, curated guest lists, walked through her mansion like nothing had changed. But the truth was unavoidable. The new generation didn't fear her. They didn't even envy her. They simply moved past her. And Caroline Astor, once the Queen of New York, couldn't stop the future from arriving uninvited. The invitations kept going out, embossed, gilded, handwritten in calligraphy, so delicate it could pass as lace. But fewer responded now. The names that once begged to appear in Caroline's ballroom were fading. They had either aged with her or evolved past her. She still held court, still sat like an empress under chandeliers imported from Europe, her posture rigid, her judgment sharper than ever, but it wasn't the same. The world outside the mansion had shifted. New York's skyline was climbing higher than her family had ever dared to dream. Steel now rose where stone once stood. Electricity buzzed through streets that had once been lit by gas lamps. The age of invention had arrived, and it wasn't asking for permission. It was kicking down doors. Caroline noticed the change in the people before she noticed it in the walls. Her son, Jack Aster, who preferred yachts over etiquette and headlines over hushed conversations, had no interest in her rules. The newspapers called him flashy. She called him foolish. He hosted dinners that blended oil tycoons with opera singers, war heroes with foreign investors. Caroline was appalled, but the public loved him. He was the future, and she, the past. Still, she clung to her fortress of order. The Astor mansion remained the most polished bubble in a city now boiling over with industry, immigration, and innovation. But bubbles pop eventually, and this one was starting to tremble. When her beloved husband died in 1892, she wore black for months, though their marriage had long been more partnership than passion. She sat alone at their table, every dish served exactly as he liked it. She insisted on silence at meals, just as he'd preferred, but the silence stayed long after the plates were cleared. And this time, it wasn't dignified, it was deafening. Whispers grew louder in society circles. They asked why Caroline hadn't stepped aside, why she still sent out invitations when no one was asking for them, why she still controlled the list when the names on it had long stopped caring. But Caroline was not a woman who retreated. Instead, she launched her most ambitious social event yet, an opera gala so grand, so theatrical, it was meant to silence every doubt. It was a performance not just for New York's elite, but for history. She wore deep purple velvet and a diamond brooch the size of a plum. The chandeliers reflected in her eyes like stars trapped in glass. The menu had 12 courses. The wine was shipped from Bordeaux in secret batches, each bottle older than most guests. It was magnificent. But it didn't matter, because 2 blocks away, a younger woman was throwing her own event, a costume ball with electric lights, a jazz quartet, and a guest list that included bankers, artists, and European royalty. It was modern, it was dangerous, it was real, and it was full. Caroline's gala sparkled, but it echoed. Empty corners, awkward pauses, guests who slipped out early. It was a museum in motion, gorgeous, ornate, and lifeless. That night, as the footmen cleared the tables and the orchestra packed away their instruments, Caroline sat alone in her drawing room, her gloves still on. She looked at the door. No one returned for a private word. No one lingered. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply exhaled, as if letting go of an empire she had spent decades building. Outside, the city refused to slow down. The subway lines stretched underground like veins. The Statue of Liberty stood across the harbor, a symbol of welcome for the tired and the poor, 2 things Caroline Astor had spent her life shielding society from. Tenements rose beside mansions. And the newspapers? They had a new queen. Her name was Mamie Fish, known for her scandalous sense of humor, outrageous parties, and refusal to play by Astor's rules. Mamie once hosted a dinner where the guest of honor was a monkey dressed in a tuxedo. Another time, she hired an actor to pretend he was a foreign prince just to humiliate the guests who fawned over him. Caroline was horrified. But Mamie was a hit. Caroline's name, once uttered in awe, now felt like a footnote. Her every move seemed antiquated. Even her fashion became a statement of resistance. High collars, dark colors, gloves that swallowed her wrists. Still, she fought back. She attempted to reassert dominance by founding exclusive women's clubs, issuing carefully worded criticisms of modern manners, and taking jabs at younger socialites in hushed luncheons. But the air had changed. The younger generation didn't want to be measured by the 400. They wanted to burn it down. Her son Jack, once merely embarrassing, had become a public fascination. He commissioned a yacht larger than any in America, traveled to Egypt and sent back photos of himself on camels, married a much younger woman. Caroline disapproved, of course, but he didn't ask her permission. And then he booked a ticket on a ship called the Titanic. When news broke that the unsinkable had sunk, the world gasped. Caroline froze. For days, she refused to eat. Servants said they heard her murmuring his name in empty hallways, and when word arrived that Jack had died saving others, giving up his lifeboat seat to women and children, Caroline didn't shed a single tear in public. But something inside her broke for good. She never hosted another ball. The grand Aster mansion, once pulsing with society's rhythm, dimmed. The carpets faded. The staff thinned. The chandeliers gathered dust. Caroline still received callers, still sat in her parlor like a portrait unwilling to be taken down. But she stopped speaking about the future. She lived in memory now, a carefully arranged museum of her own making. Reporters began calling her the last empress, not out of reverence but pity. She had become a symbol of a world that no longer existed, an echo trying to outshout a storm. The Gilded Age had moved on from corsets to jazz, from carriages to Cadillacs, and the Queen of New York, once feared and followed, had become a ghost while still alive. When asked in her final years about the society she once ruled, she would smile thinly and say, "It was never mine. I merely gave it structure." But that wasn't true. She had built it from dust and names, stitched it together with silk and silence, and now it was slipping through her gloved fingers. The house was quieter now, not in the elegant way it had once been, when silence was the mark of sophistication, when whispered conversations floated between crystal and candelabras. This silence was heavier, stale. It settled in corners like dust and made even the ticking of the long case clock in the hallway feel accusatory. Caroline no longer dressed for dinners. The gowns still hung in her armoire, satins, silks, velvets in colors that once declared power, but they hadn't been touched in months. Instead, she wore black, always, not out of mourning for her husband anymore, nor even for Jack, but for something more abstract, a kind of dignity that felt buried. Every morning, her maid would enter the room with fresh flowers. That had always been the ritual. Lilies in the spring, hydrangeas in the fall, but now Caroline barely acknowledged them. She didn't scold the girl if the vase was smudged, or if the petals drooped slightly. That was perhaps the most unnerving change. Her silence had lost its edge. It no longer carried warning, only weariness. The city outside, meanwhile, had become louder than ever. Buildings now stretched to impossible heights. Automobiles rattled across cobblestone streets, spitting smoke and curses. A new soundscape had emerged, one of urgency, electricity, and ambition. The world was sprinting forward, and Caroline was still trying to move with the grace of a waltz. The social columnists, once her scribes, had found new muses, the daughters of steel barons, the wives of railroad kings, women with loud voices and louder clothes. They posed for photographs with new confidence, laughed openly at banquets, and boasted about their Paris gowns not for their embroidery, but for their price tags. Caroline watched it all unfold with a cold kind of clarity. She understood now that she hadn't merely aged out of relevance. She had been erased by a generation that no longer needed gatekeepers. The society she once curated with surgical precision had become self-inventing. It was no longer about lineage. It was about spectacle. And Caroline Aster had never been a spectacle. She had been an institution. The final blow came not from society, nor from her enemies, but from her own blood. Her granddaughter Ava had announced her engagement to a man of no name, a Wall Street gambler, rumored to have made his fortune manipulating stocks and charming senators' wives. Ava had eyes like Caroline's, cold, assessing, but a smile that bent rules instead of enforcing them. Caroline forbade the match. She sent letters, summoned Ava, even attempted to leverage what little social influence she had left by whispering threats to the Mansip's associates. But Ava stood firm. "You ruled a city," she told her grandmother. "I just want to survive in it." The words stung, not because they were disrespectful, but because they were true. For the first time in decades, Caroline Aster felt irrelevant in her own home. She retreated further, withdrew from the ladies' luncheons, stopped hosting her annual tea, ignored the few remaining callers who showed up in carriages too modest for the driveway. She no longer sat in the drawing room with a fan in her hand and opinions on her tongue. Instead, she took to reading, old letters mostly, notes from guests who once begged to be included in her soirée, invitations from foreign courts, now faded and crinkled, even a few telegrams from Jack, written in youthful scrawl and peppered with mischief. She read them again and again, until the ink blurred in her memory. Sometimes, late at night, she wandered the halls in silence, one hand grazing the wallpaper, the other clutching a candle. She moved like a shadow, inspecting rooms that no longer held purpose. The grand ballroom where she once danced with dukes and diplomats was now cloaked in sheets. The mirrors were draped. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and forgotten dreams. And still, every so often, a spark would flicker behind her eyes, a whisper of rebellion, a reminder that even an aging queen can sharpen her crown. It happened one autumn afternoon. The city was abuzz with rumors of a foreign duchess visiting Manhattan, one known for her scandalous affairs and modern views. Society buzzed with anticipation, desperate to host her. The new class scrambled to offer invitations, but she declined them all, except one. Caroline Aster's. The Duchess arrived in a carriage, flanked by curious onlookers and the press. Caroline received her in the library, dressed in charcoal silk, her hair pinned with precise cruelty. No photographers were allowed, no reporters admitted, only the Duchess, the staff, and Caroline. They spoke for hours. No one knows what was said, but when the Duchess emerged, she reportedly said, "She may no longer host balls, but she still commands a kingdom." For one brief moment, the city remembered who Caroline Aster was. It didn't last. But Caroline didn't expect it to. That single afternoon had been enough, a final act, a curtain call for a woman who had shaped an entire era from behind velvet doors and damask drapes. She spent the next few weeks writing, not to society or her family, but to herself. Small notes, scribbled in journals, tucked inside drawers, observations about the city's new tempo, memories of her rise, regrets, few as they were, and reflections on the price of influence. She wrote not to relive her past, but to record it, because she understood something the rest of the city hadn't realized yet. The Gilded Age had been an illusion, gold leaf over iron, charm masking control, grace disguising dominance, and she had been its architect. But upstairs, in the solitude of her room, Caroline remained sharp. She followed the headlines. She clipped articles, circled names. She even underlined phrases she found vulgar or amusing. The old queen had not been dethroned. She had simply stepped back into shadow, observing a world she no longer wished to control, but could never stop understanding. The day she fell ill, the city didn't notice. No headlines, no speculation. Just a brief note in one column days later, sandwiched between two advertisements, Mrs. Caroline Aster said to be in poor health. She would recover, but never fully. And as the new century lurched forward, as radio waves began to crackle through parlors and skyscrapers clawed at the clouds, one woman sat silently behind silk curtains watching it all, the same way she always had. Unseen but never unknowing. The winter Caroline dreaded arrived not with snow but with silence, dense, unmoving. as if the world outside had paused to watch what would become of the last woman standing from an empire now reduced to memory. The windows of her Fifth Avenue mansion remained curtained even in daylight. The sounds of carriages and bells, once the score to her daily rituals, now felt like echoes from a life she'd only dreamed. Every step she took echoed through empty hallways that had once trembled under the weight of pearls and whispers. Her health had declined slowly, like her influence. There had been no dramatic collapse, no night of agony, just a gradual loss of breath, of appetite, of purpose. The doctors called it fatigue. The staff whispered that she was simply fading, like a portrait left too long in the sun. But Caroline knew better. She wasn't dying of illness, she was dying of irrelevance. Her son had stopped visiting months ago. Her granddaughter had married the Wall Street man against her will and sent a single note after the wedding, a card with no return address, no apology, just a photograph of the happy couple, and a message scrawled in the margin, "You once ruled the world. I only want to live in it." The words weren't meant to wound, but they did. Caroline stared at that photograph for hours the night it arrived. The girl wore a satin dress that looked like one she'd once forbidden for being too loud. The groom smiled with the ease of a man who knew charm would always outrun consequence. Caroline lit a match and burned the card in the fireplace, but the words stayed. She had never feared death, but obscurity that was different. There had been a time when her every glance carried meaning, her every gesture rewrote etiquette. But now, even her absences went unremarked. And yet, there was a strange power in solitude, in watching the empire she built become unrecognizable, in letting go of the performance, in remembering that before she was society's architect, she had been a woman, a girl from a powerful southern family, a bride thrust into northern aristocracy, a mother navigating grief, a widow cloaked in ambition. Somewhere beneath the diamonds and damask, she had always been searching for something more than legacy. She had been searching for freedom. One evening, as frost traced the edges of the stained glass windows, Caroline rose from her bed and walked to her husband's study. It had remained untouched since his passing. The staff had once asked if they should turn it into a morning room or cigar lounge. She had refused. The room smelled faintly of ink and cedar. On the desk, covered in a thin film of dust, lay a single book, his ledger, the same ledger he had kept through wars and markets and recessions. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were names she hadn't thought of in years, men who had dined in her ballroom, women who had borrowed her silks, debts repaid, debts forgotten. At the back, a single sheet in her husband's hand. "Caroline will never be remembered as my wife. I will be remembered as her husband." The words stopped her breath. Not because they were grand, but because they were true. And still, even he hadn't understood the cost. She hadn't just maintained order, she had manufactured reality. For decades, she had been the invisible hand arranging marriages, destroying reputations, elevating strangers to stardom with nothing but a nod. Her strength had not been inherited, it had been forged in fire. She had given up everything to wear the invisible crown, and now that the city no longer needed queens, she wore it still, even if only in private. That night, she summoned her butler, not the senior one. He had long retired, but a younger man, respectful, still slightly frightened of her. She asked for two things: a list of every debutante being presented in the coming season, and a mirror. The request puzzled him, but he returned swiftly with both. She stared at the names first, so many she didn't recognize. New blood, new power, new rules. Then she looked into the mirror. The face that stared back was sharp, as ever. Age had not dulled her bones or her eyes, but there was something different. Not softness. No, she had never had time for that. It was clarity. She looked like a woman no longer pretending to be more than mortal, and she smiled. She sent out letters the next day, not to the press, not to the old guard, but to the new, the daughters of barons, the wives of merchants, the women who wore diamonds as declarations. She invited them to tea, not a ball, not a gala. Tea, intimate, measured. impossible to decline. They all came. Curiosity had always been society's strongest drug, and Caroline Aster was a mystery too rich to ignore. The drawing room was prepared precisely. No photographers, no music, just sunlight through tall windows and silver trays filled with restraint. When the women arrived, they did not find an ancient relic waiting to plead for relevance. One guest, a fashion heiress barely 22, later told a columnist, "It felt like being judged by history." And maybe that was Caroline's final move. She didn't beg for restoration, she orchestrated remembrance. Let them see what elegance once looked like. Let them compare it to their noise and novelty. Let them wonder if they had truly moved forward, or merely sideways. By the end of the evening, no one had dared speak over her. No one had checked their watch. And as they left, each carrying a small envelope she had prepared, they understood what few ever had. Caroline Aster was not a name on a list. She had been the list. And that finally was all right. It was the quiet after the tea that unsettled her most. Not the kind that accompanied peace, but the silence of something irreversible. Caroline Aster had held court one last time, but the air that followed wasn't reverent. It was final. She didn't say it aloud, but she knew the women hadn't come for her. They came for the idea of her. The myth, the last breath of a world they no longer lived in, but still feared to forget. The envelope she had handed them one by one contained no secrets, just a quote, handwritten in her sharp script. "What is remembered lives longer than what is built." It was her farewell, but she hadn't yet decided if it was also her surrender. In the weeks that followed, the society pages were filled with speculation. Why had she resurfaced? Was she planning a return? Would there be a winter ball? The whispers weren't loud enough to echo, but they clung to the upper crust like frost on a window, visible, temporary, poetic. Caroline didn't respond. She read every article in silence, her teacup untouched, her eyes colder than the porcelain it sat on. They didn't understand. This wasn't a comeback. It was a curtain call. One carefully staged act to remind the city who had shaped its soul. Still, something inside her stirred. Perhaps it was the thrill of being watched again, or perhaps it was the unsettling feeling that her role was still unfinished. Power, once tasted, never truly leaves the tongue. It lingers, a phantom flavor, seductive and cruel. So when a letter arrived from the Historical Society inviting her to speak at a private event, a reflection on New York's social foundations, she didn't hesitate, she didn't decline, she didn't even pause, she said yes. The speech was brief. She stood at the podium in her black lace, framed by bookshelves and gaslight, and spoke as if reciting scripture. "What you call the Gilded Age," she said, "was not a time, it was a mirror. We didn't build a society, we built reflections, polished, rehearsed, unforgiving, and we judged anyone who blurred." She paused, watching them absorb the words. "But what no one tells you is that reflections crack, eventually, and when they do, you must decide if you will stand among the shards or walk away from the glass." No one clapped at first. Then, slowly, deliberately, they rose. Applause followed, not wild but solemn, respectful, as if they'd been allowed to witness something sacred. Afterward, a young historian approached her with reverence too eager to mask. "Mrs. Astor," he said, "do you regret anything?" She didn't smile. "I regret only the moments I confused control with meaning." The boy didn't understand. Not really, but he nodded anyway. That night, she returned home and ordered the staff to dust off the trunks in the attic. Not her dresses. Those were already boxed, preserved, catalogued. But the letters, the diaries, the invitations with names now forgotten, the discarded seating charts with notes in the margins, evidence of a system once absolute. She moved slowly through them, memory unraveling like ribbon. Here was the list of names she had once refused entry to her ballroom. There, the reply from a duchess, thanking her for arranging a scandal's quiet burial, each piece a thread, each thread a web. She realized, almost with sadness, that she knew more about the skeleton of her society than anyone alive. The historians would write their books, the descendants would tell their tales, but only she remembered the truth between the lines, the favors, the betrayals, the threats softened into invitations, the love affairs covered in diamonds and silence, and at the center of it all, her, not just the gatekeeper, but the architect, the ghost in the drawing room, the hand that held the pen while others believed they were writing history. And for the first time, she wondered if her story should be told in full, not filtered through rose-colored retrospectives, not confined to the margins of other people's achievements, but raw, real. She considered dictating it, perhaps to the same young historian, not for vanity, for vengeance, against forgetting, against oversimplification, because she had not been a relic, she had been a revolution hiding in velvet. But just as quickly, she dismissed the thought. The truth wouldn't serve anyone, and she had no interest in becoming a cautionary tale. Let them wonder. Let the city reinvent her in stone and silver. Let the stories stretch and collapse, like corsets unstrung. Her power had never been in what she revealed. It had always been in what she withheld. She returned to her rooms and closed the curtains. The city glowed as always, impatient and glittering. Below she heard laughter, young voices spilling from a passing carriage. She imagined them, girls wrapped in furs, boys chasing ambition, and she didn't resent them, not anymore. They weren't her replacements. They were her legacy's inevitability. The world she had ruled could not exist forever, but the silence she left behind would echo longer than any of their noise. As she prepared for bed, her maid asked timidly if she'd be attending the opera the next week. "Your box has been reserved by the new patron," the girl whispered, afraid of overstepping. Caroline paused. The box had once been hers, the central one, the crown jewel of the hall. It had been passed without announcement, taken without ceremony, and yet she smiled. "Let them have it," she said. "Let them believe they own it. The ones who matter will always remember who sat there first." When she turned off the lamp that night, the darkness did not feel like defeat. It felt like arrival. The storm came without thunder. It began with a name, one whispered at salons and scribbled in the corners of gossip columns: Alva Vanderbilt. Her arrival was not theatrical but strategic. She did not crash through doors. She waited until they were opened for her, and once inside, she smiled as if she had always belonged. Caroline heard her name first at a luncheon she hadn't planned to attend. The women said it casually, like a new perfume or a favored milliner. "She's refreshing," one murmured. "So unlike the old guard," said another. Caroline said nothing, but the air had shifted, and she felt it in her bones. Ava didn't just dress modern. She thought modern. She didn't wait for approval from women like Caroline. She courted the press. She gave speeches. She attended art exhibitions, not for patronage but for opinion. Her presence wasn't soft. It was sharp, magnetic, dangerous. The newspapers called it the Gilded Renaissance, a new wave of socialites redefining elegance, wealth, and womanhood. Ava was their beacon, the daughter of steel, the wife of speculation. Her money was loud, her reputation louder. She hosted balls where industrialists danced with artists. She printed the guest lists in advance, on purpose. She gave access, not just invitation. And though she never challenged Caroline directly, her very existence was a declaration. The age of velvet was over. The age of spectacle had begun. But Caroline was not a ghost yet. She watched, she studied, she waited. She began appearing again, not at her own events, but at Ava's. She moved through the rooms like a shadow wrapped in pearls. No one could look away. Some said she was there to reclaim her throne. Others said she was there to bless the new queen. But Caroline knew the truth. She was hunting, and she was patient. At one gala, Ava approached her directly. "Mrs. Astor," she said, offering her hand like a dove that could turn hawk in an instant. "It's an honor." Caroline took it, slowly. That depends, she said. Honors must be earned, not declared. Ava didn't flinch. Then I hope I'm earning yours. It was not sarcasm. It was ambition disguised as courtesy. Caroline respected it, but she did not trust it. That evening, she returned home and pulled a file from her private study, a record of every family that had ever sought her approval. The Vanderbilts had once been on that list. Ava's grandfather had been denied entry to her ballroom. Too new, too brash, too loud. Now his granddaughter was rewriting the very rules Caroline had lived by. She wasn't angry. She was intrigued. There was a strange poetry to it. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was unraveling beneath the surface. That feeling was confirmed 2 weeks later when the Times published an op-ed titled "The Death of Decorum." It did not mention Caroline by name, but its target was unmistakable. "The age of quiet power has passed," it read. "In its place stands a new femininity, visible, vocal, victorious." Ava was quoted liberally throughout. Legacy means nothing without relevance. Caroline read it twice. Then she lit a match and watched the paper curl into ash. It wasn't the insult that burned. It was the truth hidden within it. She summoned her butler and dictated a letter to be hand-delivered to the editor-in-chief of the Times. It was not a rebuttal. It was a reminder. "I do not speak for a fading era," she wrote. "I speak for the architecture of civility. Without it, you are not modern. You are simply loud." She signed it without flourish. Just her name. It appeared in the next issue, unedited, and the city held its breath. Ava, to her credit, responded with silence. No interviews, no comment, but she made her move differently. The following month, she announced a museum gala dedicated to the women who built New York. It featured portraits, letters, even ballroom blueprints. Caroline's name was included, but so were dozens of others. It was inclusion by dilution, legacy by committee. Ava wasn't erasing her, she was absorbing her, folding the myth into a tapestry that she alone now curated. Caroline declined the invitation. That night, she stared at her reflection longer than usual, her face lined with years and victories. Her eyes, still sharp but heavy with the weight of watching. She touched the brooch at her neck, the same one she had worn the night she introduced Fifth Avenue's elite to the world. It had once caught gaslight like diamonds. Now it barely glinted in the electric glow. She took it off. The next morning, she ordered the portrait in the drawing room to be removed. It was her, in her prime, painted in oil, framed in gold. It had hung for 40 years. A symbol of reign. She told the staff to place it in storage, not because she was ashamed, but because the war had changed, and this time she wasn't sure she wanted to win. What haunted her most wasn't Ava. It was the question she couldn't answer. Had she built a society or merely a stage? And if it was just a stage, had she ever truly mattered? She wandered the hallways that night, remembering the laughter, the orchestras, the scent of roses freshened every hour. Now the rooms were quiet, beautiful, but hollow. She had taught them elegance, order, dominance, but no one had taught her how to let go. In the library, she opened a book she hadn't touched in decades, her husband's gift on their first anniversary, inscribed in Latin, "Tempus fugit, memento vivere," time flies. Remember to live. She stared at the words until they blurred. Maybe that was the curse of power. You spent so much time preserving it, you forgot to spend it. Outside, the city pulsed with a new rhythm. Faster, brighter, unapologetic. Ava Vanderbilt was not the future, she was the now. And Caroline Aster, once the gatekeeper, now the ghost, was finally beginning to understand that some crowns are not passed down. They are stolen, worn boldly, and never returned. Caroline awoke to silence, the kind that pressed against the ribs and made every breath feel borrowed. The house was full, yet empty. Footsteps echoed more than they used to, as if the walls had grown hungry for voices. She rose earlier than usual, not because sleep had ended, but because dreams had turned on her. In them, the ballroom was full again, but she wasn't in control. She was a guest, uninvited, wandering without purpose. Even in sleep, the past was receding. She summoned no maids. She dressed herself. An old habit revived, perhaps out of rebellion. The silk was heavier than she remembered. Or maybe she was lighter, thinning out in spirit like the air before a storm. At breakfast she stared at the unopened letters, condolences, invitations, charity appeals. All of them felt like noise scratching at glass. She had once read them with a red pencil, circling names, deciding fates. Now they sat untouched. The pencil lay dull in the drawer. Somewhere Ava was making headlines again. But she lied. She always had. Power wasn't something she could give up. It had to be taken from her, piece by piece. And that process had already begun. That night, she wandered into the ballroom she hadn't used in years. Dust had gathered in polite corners. Chandeliers hung like forgotten stars. She stood at the center and imagined the music, the laughter, the dresses swirling like petals in a storm. Her eyes welled not from sorrow, but from rage. Not at Ava, not at time, but at herself, for allowing silence to win. She began making plans the next morning, quietly, deliberately. She invited an editor from the Tribune for tea, not to reminisce, but to leak. "You'll want to write about history," she said, "because history is what repeats, especially when it's ignored." Over the next week, a series ran titled The Real Mothers of Manhattan. Each article centered on a different woman from Caroline's era, pioneers of charity, education, urban reform, all woven together through one common thread, Caroline's influence. The city buzzed again, not with gossip, but reverence. Ava did not respond publicly, but she started canceling appearances. Still, Caroline wasn't satisfied. She needed to remind the city what elegance looked like, what power felt like when it wore gloves. She announced a masquerade ball, the first in 15 years, by invitation only, hand-delivered, embossed in gold. The guest list was curated, not by status, but by legacy. Children of titans, widows of visionaries, poets, architects, composers. She was building not a party, but a monument, one night to reclaim the myth. When the night came, the city held its breath. Limousines lined Fifth Avenue, photographers perched on balconies. It felt like a resurrection. Caroline descended the staircase, not like a woman returning, but like a ghost reclaiming her house. She wore black, not for mourning, for dominance. Silence fell as she entered the ballroom. Every camera turned, every eye followed. It was not just a moment, it was a reckoning. Ava arrived late, alone. Her dress, shimmering gold, caught every flicker of candlelight, a crown without thorns. She walked toward Caroline with a smile carved in diamonds. "This is exquisite," she said. Caroline extended a gloved hand. "This is memory," she replied. "Exquisite is what comes after." They danced only once, and not with each other, but the message was clear. Caroline was not gone. She had simply been waiting for the right curtain call. But victories, like ghosts, don't stay long. 3 nights later, Caroline collapsed in her study. A mild stroke, the doctor said. Recoverable, but limiting. Speech would return slowly. Mobility, uncertain. The city wept politely. Columns were written. Ava sent flowers, white lilies. No note, none was needed. The metaphor wrote itself. Confined to bed, Caroline watched from her window as spring arrived late that year. The garden bloomed cautiously, as if asking permission. She no longer held court. Visitors came less often. Even Jack seemed rushed when he stopped by. The world had resumed spinning without her gravity. Ava had announced a new initiative, opening private museums inside the homes of New York's oldest families. To preserve the heartbeat of heritage, she had said. But Caroline knew better. Ava wasn't preserving, she was replacing. One afternoon, a young journalist requested an interview. She said she was writing a book on the Gilded Age. Caroline agreed. The girl arrived nervous, notebook trembling. "Do you think," she asked, "that society as you knew it mattered?" Caroline smiled faintly. "Mattered," she echoed. "My dear, we were the architects of illusion. We gave the city a dream to chase. That's not nothing." "And Ava?" the girl asked. "Is she the future?" Caroline's eyes narrowed. "She is the echo," she said. "Louder perhaps, but never first." That night, as she lay awake, Caroline thought of her own mother, stern, invisible, immovable, a woman who believed in silence as strength. Caroline had built an empire out of that silence, but now she wondered if the silence had built walls instead of bridges. She had kept her power, but had she kept herself? The house creaked in rhythms she had once memorized. Now they sounded foreign, like a language she had forgotten how to speak. She closed her eyes and saw the ballroom again, not filled with people but with ghosts. Women in gowns of mist, men with marble faces, all watching, all waiting. She reached out to them, not for guidance but forgiveness. She whispered only one word before sleep claimed her. Almost. Caroline didn't die that night, but something inside her did. The morning sun slid across the polished floor like a spotlight, searching for its lead actress, only to find an empty stage. She remained in bed, barely blinking, her fingers curled tightly around a single handkerchief, embroidered with her mother's initials. The nurse tried to speak. Caroline turned her head away, not out of weakness, out of defiance. The world had moved without her once. She would not rush to follow it again. By the third week, the mansion was quieter than a mausoleum. The staff rotated silently, as if afraid to disturb a queen who might still wield invisible power. But Caroline no longer summoned anyone. Her voice came back in pieces, like glass recovered from ash. When she did speak, it was in whispers, fragments of old rules, names long buried, sentences without verbs. But the tone always commanding. Even now she was trying to shape the story. One afternoon, a storm rolled in. The sky cracked, the windows shook. Caroline asked for a mirror, not to see her reflection, but to remember who she had once been. What stared back was not the woman who had ruled New York with an iron fan. It was something else, something rawer. Later, alone again, she thought about that phrase. For years, she had believed she was building a sanctuary, a fortress of grace in a brutal world. But maybe she had only gilded her own prison. Maybe the rules she wrote had bound her just as tightly. Her power hadn't freed her. It had fossilized her. And now, the city she'd helped design had no place left for her bones. News arrived that Ava was opening a cultural center, a restored tenement-turned-museum honoring immigrant women. The real mothers of New York, the banner said. The media called it revolutionary. The Times said Ava had changed the social conversation. Caroline smiled without joy. She had once changed it too. But her revolution had been quiet, embroidered into invitations and whispered across tablecloths. Ava's was loud, digital, televised. The difference wasn't strategy, it was time. One night, Caroline asked her nurse to bring her the oldest scrapbook, the one with photos faded into silver. She traced each picture with trembling fingers. Her wedding day, her son as a child, the first quadrille ball. Every face smiled. Every frame lied. History always did. She paused at one photo, her younger self on the steps of the Fifth Avenue mansion, wearing white gloves and a veil of certainty. She was dangerous, Caroline whispered to no one, because she thought she'd never break. The nurse stood silently by the doorway, not daring to interrupt. She had been with Caroline only 5 months, but she knew now what most of the city never did, that the grande dame of Manhattan had lived not just for status, but for survival. Every dress was armor, every party a negotiation, every silence a strategy. Caroline hadn't just ruled society, she had defended herself from it. The next morning, Caroline sat by the window, no longer in bed, no longer afraid. She asked for tea and drank it without help. Something had returned, not youth, not strength, but will. She requested a visitor, not Jack, not Ava, someone from the archives. She wanted to speak to the woman who had requested an interview weeks earlier, the one writing about the Gilded Age. Tell her, she said to the nurse, that my silence is done. If the city insists on writing my obituary, I shall supply the punctuation. The woman arrived nervous again, her notebook fuller now, her eyes sharper. Caroline motioned for her to sit. You asked once if it all mattered, she began, her voice steadier than expected. Let me answer. She spoke not like a relic, but like a storm buried beneath marble. She told stories never published, about rivals paid to disappear, secrets bought with charity, betrayals woven into bouquets. I didn't just host New York, she said. I choreographed its shadow. The writer sat stunned, her pen slowing. Why now, she asked. Because Caroline said, I want the last waltz to be mine. The interview lasted 3 hours. By the end, the journalist looked drained, as if she'd spoken to both history and a ghost. Caroline smiled. When you print it, she said, print it with silence. Let them read between the lines. The woman promised she would. Weeks passed. The house remained untouched, but inside, movement resumed. Caroline walked short distances now, dictated letters, read headlines. She was not returning to society. She was studying it from afar, like a queen who had abdicated but kept the crown in a drawer just in case. Ava finally visited, not uninvited, but not announced either. She entered the solarium with flowers and soft eyes. They say you're stronger, she offered. They say many things, Caroline replied, most of them true. Eventually, Ava didn't sit. She stood like someone making peace with an ancestor. I'm naming a wing after you, she said. At the center, Caroline raised an eyebrow. You believe in monuments now? Ava nodded. Only for the dangerous women. There was no embrace, no apology, but something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, not approval, just understanding. Caroline turned to the window again. Build whatever you like, she said. Just remember, it sips not the crown that matters. It sips what you bury with it. That night, she stood before her mirror one last time. She wore no black, no pearls, just a grey shawl and a faint smile. She looked older, frailer, but there was a spark behind her eyes, a flare that said the story wasn't over, even if the chapter was. She didn't sleep. She watched the city lights flicker like distant chandeliers, dimming one by one. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if rehearsing a name or a regret. And when dawn came, she was still awake, alive, alert, and ready. The story should have ended there, an old woman in a faded mansion, offering final words to a younger world. But the city wasn't done with Caroline Aster. It never is with women who once held the map and the compass. As whispers of her interview began to leak, a ripple moved through Manhattan. Editors called it historical gold. Socialites called it betrayal. But behind velvet doors, they all asked the same question: why now? When the story published, it wasn't just gossip. It was revelation. Caroline's confessions were crafted like prose, sharp, poetic, and unnervingly honest. She detailed secret wars, names she'd protected, alliances that shaped fortunes. She didn't plead innocence. She claimed intention. Society was never pure, she wrote. It was precise. I made it so. She admitted the cost. I did not raise sons. I raised heirs. I did not host parties. I tested loyalty. I do not regret this. I regret only the moments I mistook power for permanence. The city reacted like a stage struck by thunder. Some praised her. Some called for erasure. But everyone read. Everyone quoted. On the Upper East Side, women whispered her lines like scripture. Downtown, younger women debated her legacy in cafes. Had she been a tyrant, a tactician, or just a woman who learned the rules too well to live freely? Ava, faced with questions from the press, chose silence. Her foundation released a single statement: every era has its architects. Some build structures, others build myths. We honor both. Caroline didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her story was no longer hers. It had entered the bloodstream of the city she once commanded. Weeks passed. And the letters began arriving. Not fan mail, testimonies. Women of all ages sent handwritten notes, typed pages, old photographs. "You reminded me I wasn't invisible," one read. "You made me feel like power could look like me," said another. Caroline read each one, slowly, reverently, as if collecting fragments of a cathedral no one knew they were building. One letter stood out. It was from a woman named Eliza, age 84, once a maid in the Aster home. "You never saw me," it said, "but I saw you. Every night you rehearsed your posture in the mirror. You thought we weren't watching. We always were." They sat together without speaking for a long time, just breathing in the quiet. Then Jack asked the question he sipped, never dared before. "Was I ever enough?" Caroline turned, her expression unreadable. "You were a chapter," she said, "but I was writing a kingdom." The next day, Ava visited again. This time she sat. No distance, no posture. She brought with her a small box. Inside, a key. "To what?" Caroline asked. Ava smiled softly. "To the wing, the one we named after you. I thought maybe you'd want to see it yourself before. Well, just in case." Caroline looked at the key like it held time itself. "What if I don't like what you've built?" Ava's answer came without pause. "Then tell me, I'll rebuild it." She stared at the words for a long time, then turned to Ava. "You should have added the second line," she said. Ava raised a brow. "Their second line?" Caroline nodded. "But strategy is still a cage if you forget the exit." That night, Caroline returned to her room and asked for the fireplace to be lit. Not for warmth, for memory. She placed the last of her invitations into the flames. The gold ink curled like old lies. She didn't cry, she smiled. A smile that wasn't bitter or nostalgic, just clean. As the fire died, she wrote one final letter, addressed to no one. "If you sip a reading this, then I sip am gone, or gone enough. Let this be my final rule. Break the next one. Done sip repeat me, rewrite me. That is the only way I remain alive." She signed it simply, C. By morning the nurse found her sitting in the same chair by the window, eyes closed, pulse soft, breath shallow, not gone, but going. The skyline shimmered behind her like the crown she never wore. She looked peaceful, like a woman who had finally stopped hosting, finally stopped performing, and had at last been allowed to rest. She sat still in her high-backed chair by the window, her hands resting lightly over a folded shawl, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for music only she could hear. The nurse approached with caution, unsure whether to announce herself or to just watch. And then she saw it, Caroline's chest, no longer rising, her lips parted, not in fear or pain, but something closer to a smile, like she had chosen the moment herself. The news spread slowly at first, almost respectfully. Then the city roared. "Last Empress of the Gilded Age dies at 90, read one headline. "New York bows one last time," said another, but no one knew how to mourn her properly. Caroline Aster wasn't just a woman. She had been an institution, an idea, and ideas don't pass away. They evolve, haunt, echo. Ava stood at the funeral's edge, barely blinking. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry, not because she wasn't grieving, but because she knew Caroline wouldn't want it. "Mourning is for men," Caroline had once said. "Women transform." So Ava stood, spine tall, face unreadable, just as the woman had taught her. And yet, when the casket lowered, she whispered under her breath, "You were more than myth, you were mine." Behind her, a new generation of women watched not just the ceremony, but Ava herself, as if waiting to see who would rise next. The Foundation's board wanted to rename the wing after Ava now. She refused. "It's still hers," she said. "It always was." Instead, she made one small change. On the plaque beneath Caroline's favorite quote, she added a second line, just as she'd been told to. "Elegance is not submission. It is strategy. But strategy is still a cage if you forget the exit." Back in the Astor mansion, now converted into a permanent exhibit, a little girl walked up to a velvet rope and asked her mother, Did she wear a real crown? The mother smiled. No, sweetheart. She didn't set need one. The girl nodded, thoughtful. Then maybe I won't sit either. Because Caroline Astor didn't just rewrite New York society, she rewired the ambition of every woman who came after. Her fall wasn't a tragedy. It was a choice, a surrender not to weakness, but to evolution. She let go of the world she ruled, so someone else could build one better. And if you're still watching, still holding your breath through her story, then maybe part of her lives in you too. That refusal to be forgotten, that hunger to be more than ornamental, that fire that says, if I can't have the throne, I'll build the room they place it in. So here sets your moment. Don't just admire her. Don't just quote her. Become the version of yourself they never saw coming. And if they call you too much, too bold, too old, too late, smile. That means you sit at doing it right. You write the next chapter. Let me know when you're ready to begin the next royal script, or if you want scene prompts for visuals based on this story.